You looked outside this morning, saw the rain, and made a small face. Maybe you sighed. Maybe you grabbed an umbrella. Maybe you thought about how the rain was going to make your commute slightly worse. For 300,000 years, your ancestors made a very different face when it rained. Because rain wasn't an inconvenience. Rain could kill you. For most of human history, a heavy storm wasn't background weather. It was an event. A storm could put out every fire in your camp, soak every person in your tribe, and turn a manageable cold night into a mass funeral by morning. Your great-great-grandparents 1,000 generations ago experienced rain in a way that's almost impossible for you to imagine. Let me show you what it actually meant. Start with fire. For 99% of human history, fire was not a luxury. It was the entire operating system of being alive. Fire was your heat at night. Fire was your light after sunset. Fire was how you cooked the meat that wouldn't otherwise digest. Fire was the wall that kept the leopards and the wolves out of your sleeping area. And rain destroyed fire. A heavy storm could extinguish every flame in a settlement in under a minute. The wood you had carefully gathered would be soaked through. The dry tinder you needed to start a new flame would be sopping. The friction-based fire-starting methods that ancient humans used, drilling, sawing, striking flint, almost completely fail when materials are wet. Experimental archaeologists who have tried to start fires using Stone Age methods in wet conditions report that what takes 60 seconds in dry weather can take 3 to 4 hours in heavy rain, if it works at all. Now imagine that scenario. It's been raining for 6 hours. Your fire is dead. The temperature is dropping. You have 25 people in your camp, including infants and elders. You have no flashlight, no heater, no waterproof clothing. You cannot leave the shelter because outside it's mud and predators. You have to keep that fire alive, no matter what. This is why almost every ancient settlement archaeologists have excavated shows evidence of obsessive fire management. Hearths surrounded by stone walls to block rain. Fire-keeping shelters built directly over the flames. Charred wood layers showing fires that were tended for years, sometimes decades, without ever being allowed to die. Among the Andaman Islanders who lived close to ancient hunter-gatherer patterns until the 20th century, fire was so precious that they carried smoldering embers in clay pots when they moved between settlements. Letting the embers go out was considered a catastrophic failure. A few tribes had no method at all for starting fire from scratch. They had simply inherited a flame, and the flame had to never end. Rain was the enemy of the flame, and without the flame, you were dead. Here's the part most people don't understand. A modern human wearing modern clothes in modern shelter can survive being mildly damp for a long time. We have furnaces. We have towels. We have dryers. We can swap into clean, dry clothing whenever we want. Ancient humans had none of this. The math of being wet in 50,000 BC was brutally simple. Water conducts heat away from your body about 25 times faster than air. A wet human in 50-degree temperatures will become hypothermic, not just chilly, but biologically failing, within a few hours. Without dry clothing, without a fire, without a way to reverse it, that hypothermia kills. And ancient humans had no spare clothing, no towels. The hide you wore was the hide you wore. If your shelter leaked, you got wet. If you got wet and the fire was out, you started dying. This is why archaeologists who study ancient shelter design keep finding the same features again and again. Floors raised above ground level, sometimes by half a meter, to keep sleeping areas dry when storm water seeped in. Roofs at steep angles to shed water. Layered thatching, sometimes 30 centimeters thick, to create waterproof barriers. Drainage channels cut into stone floors. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, a settlement from 26,000 years ago, researchers found drainage trenches carefully cut around the perimeter of mammoth bone houses. These were not casual structures. The people who built them understood that water was the enemy, and they had engineered against it with the kind of precision a modern civil engineer would recognize. They were not improvising. They were inheriting a knowledge base built over thousands of generations of people who had died from getting wet at the wrong time. Then there was the hunting problem. Rain made hunting nearly impossible. Animal tracks washed away. Scent trails dispersed. The bowstrings of later hunters became wet and lost their tension. The sinew bindings on stone spear points loosened. Animals hid in dens or undergrowth and refused to move. Worse, the rain itself made human hunters easier to detect. Wet bodies smelled stronger. Movement was slower in mud. Visibility dropped to a few meters. So when it rained, you couldn't hunt. And when it rained for days, which it often did during certain seasons in certain regions, you couldn't hunt for days. This is the reason food storage was developed. For most of human history, our ancestors had to keep weeks of food on hand at any given time because there was no guarantee that the next week would allow them to gather more. Smoked meat hanging in shelters, dried plants stored in skin pouches, fat rendered down and packed into containers, even root vegetables buried in cold storage pits to keep through the wet months. Anthropologists studying the Inuit, the Sami, and the Australian Aboriginal peoples have all documented the same pattern. Every culture that lived in a region with rainy or wet seasons developed elaborate food preservation systems. They had to. The alternative was the slow starvation of waiting out a storm. Modern people see rain and think about their commute. Ancient people saw rain and thought about whether they had enough stored food to survive the next 10 days without hunting. Imagine knowing that a storm was coming, but having no way to predict when. No weather app, no radar, no forecast, just the sky, the animals, and your gut. This is why almost every ancient culture developed extraordinary expertise in reading the natural world for signs of incoming weather. Indigenous knowledge of weather prediction, documented across hundreds of cultures, includes thousands of specific signs. The way ants build their nests higher before heavy rain. The behavior of swallows flying low when air pressure drops. The particular smell of damp earth before a storm, what we now call petrichor, which can be detected hours before the rain arrives. The way certain leaves curl on trees, the patterns of clouds at sunset, the behavior of fish in shallow water. Among the Maasai of East Africa, traditional weather prediction systems have been documented as more accurate than modern meteorological forecasts for short-term local rainfall. This knowledge wasn't decoration. It was survival infrastructure. A tribe that could predict the storm 3 hours in advance could secure the fire, bring in stored food, reinforce the shelter, and position the elders and infants in the driest spots. A tribe that couldn't predict the storm got caught. For 300,000 years, your ancestors had a relationship with the sky that you and I have lost completely. They didn't just look at clouds. They read them. They understood them the way a sailor used to understand the sea, or the way a doctor reads a heart monitor. The weather was the most important thing in their world, and they paid attention to it the way you pay attention to your phone. Now look at what they made of it. Almost every ancient culture that has been studied had a rain god. The Aztecs had Tlaloc, who controlled both nurturing rains and devastating floods. The Vedic Indians had Indra, the storm king who threw lightning bolts. The Egyptians had Tefnut, goddess of moisture. The Greeks had Zeus, whose rage was thunder. The Norse had Thor, whose hammer was the storm. The Yoruba had Shango. The Polynesians had Ranjanui, the sky father whose tears were rain. This is not coincidence. This is universal human experience. When the most powerful force you have ever encountered is something that falls from the sky, sometimes nourishing your crops and sometimes killing your children, you make sense of it the only way you can. You imagine it as a being. You give it a name. You try to negotiate with it. And nearly every culture also has a flood myth. The story of Noah. The story of Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. The story of Manu in Hindu tradition. The story of Deucalion in Greek myth. The story of the Great Flood in the Chinese Book of Documents. Anthropologists used to find this puzzling. Why would so many separate cultures on different continents in different millennia all independently invent the same story about a great flood? The most likely answer is that they didn't invent it. They lived it. For tribes living near rivers, near coasts, in low valleys, a devastating storm was a near certainty within any given lifetime. A flood that wiped out everything you knew was something your grandparents had seen, or your great-grandparents, or someone in the camp's grandparents. The flood myth wasn't fiction, it was memory. Here's the unexpected part. For all the danger rain brought, for all the deaths and the destroyed shelters and the dying fires, the long rains were also when something extraordinary happened. People were forced inside, together, in the dark. Anthropologist Polly Wissner spent years studying the Zhu Huanzi of the Kalahari, recording their conversations across day and night, across seasons. She found that during the day and during the dry months, talk was almost entirely practical. Logistics, food, hunting, where the water was, who needed help with what. But at night around the fire, and during long stretches of weather that kept people indoors, the talk shifted. 81% of conversation became stories, myths, tales of distant ancestors, songs, jokes, imagined adventures. This is where culture was born. The long rain, the storm that kept your tribe indoors for 3 days, was also the storm that produced the stories your grandchildren would tell their grandchildren. The myth of the trickster animal, the song about the lost lover, the tale of the great hunter who became a star. Some of humanity's oldest stories were probably composed by people staring at the rain. We have lost that too. When it rains now, we don't sit around a fire and tell stories. We scroll. We watch. We consume what other people have made. So tonight, if it's raining where you are, step outside for a moment. Smell the air. That smell, petrichor, comes from bacteria in the soil that release a chemical compound when raindrops hit them. You can detect it at concentrations of parts per trillion. Your nose is more sensitive to petrichor than a shark's nose is to blood. This is not an accident. Your brain was wired over millions of years to detect incoming rain at the lowest possible threshold because detecting rain early meant living. Modern humans still respond to that smell with a slight emotional shift, a kind of nostalgia we can't explain. That nostalgia is not for childhood. It's older than that. It's a recognition from a part of you that remembers what rain used to mean. For 300,000 years, your ancestors stood in cave entrances and watched the storms come in. They counted the people in their tribe. They counted their stored food. They counted the embers of the fire. They calculated whether they could survive what was coming. You stand at the window now and you think about whether to grab an umbrella. You are not bothered by the rain. You are remembering that you used to fear it.